1, 2, 3.
Welcome to Scéalta. My name is Joe Austin, and if you've just joined us or you haven't watched the Scéalta programme before, can I remind you that Scéalta is a joint production of Fáilte Fierce to Hear and Feile and Phobal. My guest this evening is my friend, and that's always a bonus. It's Philip Orr. He is a writer, a playwright, an author, a broadcaster. He's someone who's very much into community drama. He's a former school teacher, and he's someone who loves life to the full. So, Philip, good to see you. I haven't seen you for a wee while. I've spoke to you, but I haven't seen you. And I hope you're well.
I'm doing okay, Joe, as far as I know. You can never tell these days. But as far as I know, I'm doing good, yeah. And it is a while since we have met in the flesh. We've done a number of things, I think, via Zoom.
Yeah.
We're well familiar with each other's faces, I think, given the project that we've done together called The Poppy and the Lily. I think that's how we met, probably, and we've done a lot of those, haven't we?
I have, and I want to talk to you about those. I kind of outlined in one broad sweep, without taking a breath, that you had been involved in this gamut of work. So maybe let's go to the beginning of all of that. So, where are you from?
Where am I from? Well, County Down. I grew up between Gallipoli and St. Feile in an environment that I think probably as a kid I didn't relish enough. You know, when you're a teenager, you don't want to be stuck between the fields, you know, and you want to be up to the bright lights of the city. But now that I look back on it, it was pretty idyllic, actually. We're overlooking a nice lake. There were fields on either side, as I said. But idyllic though it was tough enough and for growing up for different reasons. My father was the pastor of a local church. He was the Baptist pastor. And I grew up in what was called a manse, you know. You were, if you were English, you'd call it the vicar's son, you know. That's what I was. And it wasn't an easy post, I can tell you.
You talk about the scenery that surrounded you, and you're absolutely right that as you get older, not that you or I are old, but as you get to that age, you kind of begin to appreciate sometimes the quietness of the beauty or the image of the beauty. Was it your father being a vicar or a pastor? Was it a strict upbringing?
It was strict. I mean, it was loving, and there's no doubt about it. I mean, I don't think I ever heard cross words between my mum and dad the whole time I grew up, you know. So it was like a mellow thing in many ways. But, you know, there were strict rules in little Protestant denominations like the Baptists about not, for example, on Sunday, you wouldn't watch TV. In fact, we didn't have a TV in the house. You wouldn't read books that weren't religious books or the Bible. I went out to church 3 times on a Sunday, at least. First thing in the morning, then there was a Sunday school in the afternoon, then there was what was called a gospel service in the evening, where my dad was trying to bring people into the church and see them saved, as he would have called it, converted.
Yeah.
So that was pretty tough. And then when I went to school in Downpatrick, I went to Down High School back in 1966. It was difficult enough, I suppose, especially as I got older and began to explore life. You got interested in girls, you get interested in all your studies and what you were doing. And then way on in 1972, I suppose, you know, many people were getting, especially in West Belfast, you were caught up in the awfulness of the Troubles, you know. But I was struggling with my own battle, which was that I had just discovered drama. I wanted to act in a play called The Crucible by Arthur Miller. And of course, some people in the church heard that I was acting in a play and they wanted me out of the church. And that was that. And my dad stuck up for me and saying, you know, he threatened to resign over the issue. But, you know, that was my struggle at the time. As well, of course, there were, you know, the Troubles hit us too in the countryside, just like they hit everybody else. But, you know, that was my battle at that time.
I have known you a long time, and we are friends. You're not, at least to me, you don't appear to be, despite that upbringing, you're not an overtly religious man. You talk about the fact that you were an actor, an amateur actor, that the church authorities, small as they may be, thought this wasn't acceptable. That seems to be a very harsh view of a life, particularly a life in the 60s. I mean, in the 30s or 40s perhaps, but in the 60s. Did it cause you any friction between what was a religious household and this desire to be an actor? Did that create a problem for you?
It certainly did, yeah. I mean, I have to say now, it wasn't just about drama. You know, you weren't allowed to drink, you weren't allowed to smoke, you weren't allowed to go to the cinema. You know, I remember as a kid, my dad not even wanting us to go to the circus, you know, because he thought this was a worldly occupation. Now, what I will say is that the man mellowed right the way through till he was in his 80s. But yeah, that clash, I think, was fundamental with me in thinking I want to get out of where I'm living here and go to England and go to university as far away as I can. So, I chose to do English literature, and off I went in 1973 to England to study. But yeah, it was tough in that regard, you know. But over the years, you try to reconcile yourself to your family, don't you? You know, you try to understand. And I mean, I do have a faith, but I'm a great believer that faith should be about action. You know, it should be, if it's not in the way you behave towards others, and if you're not engaged in the act of trying to reconcile one to another, I don't think the faith is worth very much, you know. So I think I learned that, you know.
Your mother, if we can touch briefly, and I want to touch on that period of university in England, but just let me ask you this question. Your mother, the vicar's wife or the pastor's wife, was she very much absorbed into the work that your father done? Was she very much a kind of a support unit for him? Yeah,
I mean, she was very much so, but in a quiet sort of way. You know, women always occupied a supportive role. When I look back on it, I think she felt a lot of unhappiness about that. You know, she wouldn't have expressed it, but I mean, she was born in 1926. She grew up in an era when women were chained to the sink and chained to their role, chained to being mothers, childbirth. So I have to kind of recognize that. So I'm really interested in the inheritance I got on both sides, you know, from the family. And you see, on my mother's side, they would have been fairly traditional unionist family. You know, I mean, I had a great uncle on my mother's side who went off to the Battle of the Somme and died in that war. And my first book was about trying to retrieve that story and that memory. You know, my great uncle would have been a dispatch rider in the old UVF in 1912, 1913 before he went into the army. So, you know, there was that side of it, and they owned a grocer's shop and, you know, in a mixed village across Gar. And I suppose, it was a unionist family, but it was the family in which I discovered that there wasn't just Protestants in the world. You know, we lived opposite the chapel. There was good relations backward and forward. And I know, you know, things were fundamentally flawed in society back then. We know that. But given that fact, there was actually quite a bit of good relations, I think. You know, I mean, I remember as a kid sitting watching people coming out of the chapel, you know, and crossing themselves, genuflecting, you know, on the way out. And, you know, and I was 2, you know. I suppose I thought everybody did that on stage, you know, sitting there looking out the window. There's great stories too. My mum talked about when she was a young girl, there was a curate, you know, who went, you know, was at the local chapel and just winked at her, you know, on the way past. I might have been born out, you know, in another context, slightly more challenging context.
I should say this in defense of your father, who I never had the privilege to meet, that they were very much the victim, or they're very much captive, not the victim, that's the wrong choice of words, but they're very much captive to their own church authorities. I mean, your father, that was his living. He lived in the manse, and he had a very small salary for being the vicar. So, I mean, any sign of rebellion from you, real or otherwise, they came down on him. They used that. So I have to say that in fairness to the man. So there's this young country boy who's come from a religious background. He ends up going to university in the 60s in England. What was that like? Was that like, wow, there's Technicolor here? Or was it a wee bit frightening?
It was terrifying initially. I mean, I've written a bit about that recently in a book of prose and poems that I've published. I mean, I was there suddenly, I knew nobody within 300 miles, you know, as I stood at the university accommodation block in Norwich over in East Anglia. It was a weird thing. And I, of course, at that time, it was not too easy to be Irish. And I was Irish. I was a Paddy. You know, I remember a great deal of fear once the IRA campaign was taking place in mainland Britain. Of course, you were a suspect of no matter who you were, if you had an Irish accent. And of course, it put me drama to good use, because every time I came back through London to catch the train back home, I put on an English accent. Or tried to. Probably they were going, you know, there's an Irish guy trying to sound English. But there were those difficulties, you know. And I remember in my first seminar, this guy saying to me, in all seriousness, he says, you're Irish, aren't you? You wouldn't be, you're all thick, aren't you? Except you, of course, because you're obviously studying philosophy, so you mustn't be thick. And he said, my mother's Irish, you know. You know, it was maybe meant to be some kind of a joke, but then you could comics were coming out with that stuff.
Quite a racist comment.
Back then. Of course it is. But it's interesting that it was in his own family there. What, you know, that's a self-denial of some sort, you know.
Yeah, of course. And did
it's
you
changed greatly since then, of course, like, but you know, in terms of those attitudes, I mean, I'm living in St. Albans briefly, or maybe more long term. And here, you know, Irish people are integrated into the community and have been for 2 generations. You know?
And of course, that's the way it should be. But can I just ask you? I want to move on. I want to move on to your teaching career. But if you were looking back on that university period, a period when most young men and women find themselves or find what's out there in that big world, for better or for worse, and some even survive it. Was there any single thing that kind of hit you that, wow, you know, this is for me? Or was it, you know, you mentioned that loneliness, was it a survival course?
I think initially it was a survival course, but by the end of it, I think I'd learned by the end of it the importance of words. I mean, you're studying English literature, that's what you're doing. You're studying words. And I you know, you learn to read things, not just to read books, but I think to read people a bit better, and maybe hopefully to read yourself a little better. And as a result of that, when I came back, I also did then a master's degree in Irish literature, not in the Gaeilge, but what was called Anglo-Irish literature then, in the English language. And I did that in Coleraine. And after that, I went ahead and decided to qualify as a teacher and began my teaching career. And I don't think I was a great teacher to begin with. I was in Friends School in Lisburn.
Just let me ask you a question about that, because it's important. And you know, you say we have been on the road together, we have worked together, we've done talks and lectures together, and anybody who's listened to you on the radio, you're a great communicator. I suspect you were a better teacher than you're giving yourself credit for. But your first post was in a Quakers school, was it? Yeah,
Friends School.
Yeah.
In the heart of Lisburn. And I think that had a big influence on me. It was a school back in the day that tended to emphasize your personal development rather than just exam results. And I thought that was important. And, you know, everybody talks a good line in personal development for students now that, you know, it's educate the whole student. Yeah. I'm not too sure back then that a lot of schools, comparable schools, weren't more interested in getting their kids through exams. It was a grammar school, I'll admit. And I feel a bit unhappy about that. That the schooling system here is so divided, not just in terms of the Catholic sector and the state sector, so-called, but also in terms of the so-called 11 plus, or what has superseded it. But given that fact, it was an environment in which we were encouraged to be tolerant, open, thoughtful. It was a school with a great tradition of community service. It was a school where there were no career talks by the armed forces, because it was seen as being, a pacifist school. I was heavily involved at one stage in CND, nuclear disarmament back in that era of the Cold War. And I asked the headmaster, could I set up a group in the school? And we did. And a lot of the kids joined it. And a lot of the kids joined us as we went out and did some, a consciousness raising, I suppose you'd call it, about CND issues. So interesting school, and it was a chance then to start getting involved in doing drama, teaching, trying my best, I suppose, to learn how to teach and to teach thoughtfully. And that went on till, when did it go on till? It was the 1990s, and then I moved, took a year out, and then moved to Downpatrick, back to my old school to teach.
Let me bring you back, because that's a great choice of words. I learned how to teach. Yeah. And, a lot of teachers, it is obviously a career. It's not a calling. It's not a vocation. It's a career, and rightly so, and that's what they choose. And other teachers, I interviewed someone recently who was currently a teacher, and they kind of gave me the finger and they said, good teachers are born in heaven. So just again to paint that sort of a sense of, what age were you when you began teaching, and what age were the pupils you were teaching?
Well, when I began teaching, I think I was 23, 24, and the pupils were anywhere from 11 to 18.
So there weren't, 18-year-olds and then 24, there wasn't that great gap.
There wasn't a gap. But I'll tell you what I really loved by the end of it was the youngest ones. I think by the time they're 15, 16, then exams were preying on their minds, Yeah. But the youngest ones, I loved that. You put 30, 12 or 13-year-olds in a room, okay, it can be hell sometimes. But also the enthusiasm and the imagination. And I tried my best always to set up my classroom in a circle, so people weren't behind desks the whole time. Tried to get them out of doors to do stuff as well. And just recognize that when you're studying poems and stories, it's a way of getting kids it's preparing them for life. There's a brilliant Seamus Heaney poem that I used to do about the death, the sad death, obviously tragic death of his little brother in a road accident.
Yeah.
Midterm break, it's called. And, I would have taught that, and I was conscious that every kid in due course becomes an adult and experiences bereavement, but it's a way of getting there and talking about it and thinking about it in advance, So for me, it wasn't just about exams and getting people through their education. It was trying my best to get them to think about life and find some resources to think about life. Well, that was the idealistic view. It wasn't always as simple as that, but that was that was the flame that burned in my mind,
Teaching, writing, poetry, plays, lectures, discussions, all involved. And I'm going to move you off from teaching, so don't be panicking about it. But it all involves communication. And It strikes me that your father, being a pastor, being a vicar, was someone who communicated to an audience, to a congregation on a weekly basis. So did you find yourself, when you were trying to communicate with these groups of kids, did you find yourself using any of the tricks or skills that you had heard as a boy from?
That's a really smart question, Joe, actually. And you're making me think about that a bit more. Capturing. Well, you see, my father was standing on a platform about, as I say, with vicars or pastors, 12 feet above contradiction, in the pulpit, whereas I was down on the level with them, But I suppose the thing is, my dad, in all the years of his work up until his 60s, he must have buried loads of people. He went into homes where tragedy happened, tragedy during the Troubles. He was a pastor in the Shankill area for a long period, and in Rathcoole. He went to jail. I went into jail to meet people who were in jail for awful crimes.
Yeah.
He had buried people. He married them. He had set them off, on their journey of life as little kids. So, he was a man. I couldn't agree with his dogma always, but he was a man. He was there for other people. There's no question about that. And a man with an assiduous work ethic. He was up at 6 a.m, studying and that kind of thing. So yeah, you realise later. You're quite right. You realise later that's pulsing in you as an influence.
That's going through you.
Yeah.
So you're off the hook. I've asked a difficult question around teaching. It just often struck me, and I've watched you in many a country hall and back room of the Felons Club or a club on the Shankill or in Rathcoole. You're in one corner getting your head around what you're going to say, and I'm in the other corner annoying you. So I'm just wondering where that skill comes from, and I threw that curveball at you, and no doubt you'll think about it. Teaching comes to an end. You were just beginning to explain then. How difficult was that decision? You've got a steady job, a steady income. You have always dabbled in reading. You've a deep interest, as you say. Words are so important to you. How hard was it just to decide, I'm giving all this up to take a chance being a writer, a community playwright, a community dramatist? Did it require a lot of thought, or was it after a night stringing?
I think I had to give up. I think the stress eventually got to me. I could have recovered for a few months and then gone back to the job. But I kind of recognized that I had burned a lot of fuel and it was time to move on. And I was fortunate in so much as, I was able to cadge a pension early out of the Ministry of Education, which really enabled me, not the full whack of a pension, but enough to kind of keep the wolf from the door. And then that's where I almost by accident fell into the whole business of taking an interest in, I suppose, what you would call at the broadest level community activity, community work. I guess my road into this was partly opened up because I had, during the 1980s, interviewed a lot of old men who'd been in the First World War. Partly, I suppose, because my great uncle had laid the ground for that for me. He died in the war. I must have been one of the people who really got a chance to talk to these old fellas. I was interested in particular about the unit that my great uncle joined, the 36th Ulster Division, and so I ended up writing about that. Unknown to me, it would become an icon for many in the loyalist community, huge icon. And so I found myself with the possibility of having a voice that would be heard inside the loyalist community. And I got really, really interested, for example, in how that story about the Battle of the Somme was becoming a huge identity story, bigger than ever it had been before. And almost like an equivalent to the Easter Rising narrative for Republicans. It was a story involving sacrifice, involving a kind of heroism, and something to model and to look at. And I noticed how a lot of men and women that I would meet on the Shankill as I went in there and did talks, lectures, and worked with community groups, they were making a really big effort to find out more about their ancestral story. Who was it that died at the Somme? Was it my great uncle and his friend from the 2 streets down? It was a way of repairing the lack of a good historical story for many of them. The many folk I met had been fairly disillusioned by school, especially the history classes that were about Julius Caesar.
Yeah.
and Elizabeth I. Now that may be relevant to Ireland, of course, Elizabeth I, but you get my picture.
I do.
To find out a story that was about them and about who they were and where they had been, and that involved tying it into a big story about the war. This great World War. And you could go to this sacred ground of the Western Front and feel a sense of dignity and pride that you had been involved. Also sacrifice, and also injustice. There's something very unjust about sending young men to fight other young men from another country, in the name of a flag. That we have to recognize that, and that's part of the story. But for many, there was a sense of being enhanced by this story, and it was important to get in there. And then I suppose out of that, I find myself starting to take an interest in how cross-community work could be done. There was room to do it. There was money to help fund it, and I was lucky enough to meet people like yourself, people like Tom Hartley at various conferences and events, and we kind of headed off, I think. And I found a way of being able to talk together about our respective histories, and that really appealed to me. I mean, I'd already been doing something else, if I might mention. I had a great interest for many, many years in the 18th century here in Belfast and the surrounding countryside, because again, I had an ancestor on my mother's side who was hanged in 90, the Reverend Archibald Warwick.
Yes, of course.
Years, of course, in the famous poem, The Man from God Knows Where.
Yeah.
So I had already done a play about Thomas Russell, the United Irishman, down in Downpatrick, and I started to do guided tours, and I was fortunate to meet Jack Duffin, who does similar tours, and we did a lot of tours together, some of them connected to Feile, others connected to various loyalist groups or, unionist groups that asked me to take them on the tours. Everybody was curious to find out what's the meaning of this story, and I really thoroughly enjoyed that.
It strikes me listening to you, and I've heard you speak with passion about that search for identity, sometimes within the unionist community and sometimes within non-political definitions of community. Did you see it as an extension of your teaching? I mean, you're now back in primarily teaching people on a voluntary basis, on a community basis, about the history which is so important within the unionist community. So were you conscious that you had moved from teaching younger people to teaching communities, or was it just kind of were you just absorbed into it?
Yes, well, you were absorbed into it, Joe, but I was conscious that you were employing some of the things you'd been taught to do, to be able to hold people's attention, to make sure you didn't wander off into byways, to make sure you made it plain and clear what you were doing, and also to learn that at any stage you have to learn from other people.
Yeah.
I remember working with all kinds of groups, but I remember one particular group I was working with, and there were a legacy from a paramilitary group, and on the outskirts of Belfast, and it was pretty tough at times. And this guy would come out with all kinds of what I perceived as being racist comments. And by and large, that didn't happen, by the way. I would say most of the groups I worked with, people were hungry, they were thoughtful, they were interested, they were good people. But this guy, boy, some of the comments he made were not good.
Yeah.
But I recognized that for me to say, look, mate,
shut up,
and sort of call him out as if from on high, with what he was saying wasn't going to do the trick at all. But rather, if we had a pint in the pub afterwards, you could chat about that and say, do you think it was, do you think calling somebody a M is a good thing, or and you could do it on a one-to-one basis. I think that sort of thing was important, and I think it was you were still teaching, but teaching and voluntarily, with people who were there voluntarily, Yeah.
I listened to, I think off the top of my head, it was an interview they gave with Sunday Sequel a while back. And I, like you, I suspect, talk to the radio, even though it doesn't talk back to me. And occasionally I talk to the television set as well. I think it does talk back to me, actually. And you were described as an Ulster historian. And I'm telling the radio, you're not an Ulster historian. You're a historian. And there aren't any borders. There aren't any kind of passageway. And I want to return to that, but I want to just move into a section of your work. You're a prolific poet. You're a very personalized poet. You're a poet that material comes really from your heart. It comes from your living experience and the stuff that you hear. Can you remember your first book? Can you remember that production? Can you remember the work leading up to it? And can you remember that first production?
Do you mean the very first book ever?
Ever? Yes, ever.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it started out with books about the First World War, and I have already mentioned, I think, the Road to the Somme, which was an exciting beginning. Though, mind you, I remember hanging around in bookshops, wondering would I ever spot anybody buying it, and you become very obsessed with whether or not.
That's what I want to ask you about.
Yeah, whether it's going to hit the headlines or not. I remember joking with Tom Hartley at one stage, like, when I saw his name go up in lights, as the book on the first book he brought out about City Cemetery, was it?
Yeah, City Cemetery.
It was #1 in the bestseller local charts, and I told him I was as jealous as hell. I guarantee you were hanging about, Tom. I said, looking to see whether or not people were buying it. So yeah, there's all kinds of insecurities that go with writing those sort of books, and likewise, I'm with a publisher down in Dublin took on my book about Gallipoli, the Irish soldiers who were there. But after that, most of what I've done has been kind of below the radar, that sort of radar. If people ask me to do a book and they have a bit of money for it, I will try my best to go ahead and do it. So, for example, just a couple of years ago, a disability project, a beautiful, really historic disability project in North Down, found a trove of photographs and stuff about their charity, back to the Victorian times, and they gave me some money to write this book, and we published it. We self-published it through the help of a publisher in Newton Ards. That gives me enormous pleasure, I mean, I've done a book, again, about loyalism and its relationship with the church. I've done more books about the First World War period. I've done books looking at the Home Rule crisis. I went up to Ballymena and worked that's a fascinating part of the world that I really grew to be intrigued by. Mid-Antrim, looking back to the period 1912-13. On the one hand, you have the heart of the Ulster Covenant there, and yet on the other hand, you have families that are heavily involved in the Ulster Volunteers, and their cousin is Roger Casement. Yeah. People like Jack White, coming and having dinner with people, who are related to him. You have all those stories that are really intriguing, and I just love stories. So any chance I've had to pen a story, if somebody gives me money to do it, I will have a go. One that I would want to mention to you is one I did about Ballyginler Army Camp. I was asked to do this project, and of course there is an utterly fascinating story. Here is a camp that the Ulster Division trained in, so it's sacred ground to loyalists and unionists. On the other hand, of course, Ballyginler Camp, internment camp, is a crucial part of the story of how many people went through it. At that time, it was a kind of a university of learning for many at that period of time who were interned there. So, I mean, I did that. I could go down a long list, of those books that I've done since.
I want to ask you, I want to return just briefly, and then I want to move on again. And it's very fair on you, but I'm trying to get as much in within a relatively short space of time. Is there a difference between the production and the writing of your first novel and your latest novel? Your first book on your latest book. And by that, what do I mean? Do you still have, and you mentioned Tom Hartley earlier on, he keeps telling everybody that he's the best-selling author, and of course he is. But he also tells people about the butterflies in the stomach. He also tells people about the rewriting and checking and changing.
Yeah.
Do you still have that sense that this book is the most important book you've ever written?
It's like, yeah, people, writers have always compared it like to having a child, and once the child is out there, they can do all kinds of awful things in your name, carrying your name around and committing the most heinous offences, and you still have to love them, and you still probably do love them.
Yeah.
And it's a terrible thing. Once a book is out, you'll always get somebody who comes to you and says, Dear Mr. Orr, this is a typical email. Dear Mr. Orr, I really enjoyed your book, but, and then say on page 35, you said it was the Shankill Road, and it wasn't. It was Sandy Row,
or Woodville, or whatever.
Yeah. And it's understandable because that's the, that's what matters to somebody who's reading it from that part of the world. So yeah, you have those worries and concerns, but then also, I had written poems for a number of years, and I had a publisher all set up there a couple of years ago, and partly because of COVID, partly because of the problems in the firm, they weren't going to do it. So I decided to self-publish. I published a book called The Illustrated History of Flight, which is not about airplanes, obviously, but it's about going to England in '73 and why. And it's about my story up to that year of '73 heading away, but it's also about trying to give a voice to the people I grew up with instead of turning my back on them. It's about trying to give a voice to the people, the people who were in that church. It's about trying to give a voice to people who, as happened, as you well know, Joe, in the period of conflict there, who joined the security forces, who joined the prison officers, joined the Ulster Defence Regiment, joined the police, and to try to understand that story, and to try to give a voice to that, became part of what I wanted to do in the book. And of course, that creates friends. It also creates enemies too, because people don't always understand what you're up to, and you have to live with that. I did an article in the Irish Times not too long ago whenever the book came out, and there were some comments that were not appreciative. But you have to live with that. You have to live with that, as well as the positive things as well. To be able to, when you try to write, you expose yourself.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that we've all suffered from selective history.
Yes.
I think we've all suffered from Republicans are prolific writers, as you know, and
oh yeah,
they're around, and that isn't matched by and large from a section of the unionist community.
That's true.
I always am of the view that there is a story to be told, and it can only be told by that community. Doesn't mean I agree with the story, by the way. It means that story has to be told, and history can't be full. You can't tell history, or we shouldn't be involved in telling history by only selecting what we like and what we don't like. So I absolutely understand. What I was going to ask you about poetry, I mean, anybody that knows you and they can get a sense of you physically by looking at this, you're a large individual, and people tend, especially people who aren't familiar with poetry, tend to look at poetry as the product of the genteel, or the product of the kind of softer, section of our community. I mean, you're a big man. Is it difficult? Is it more difficult to write poetry because it's from your heart than it is to write a history critique or a history book? Does it take more emotionally out of you?
It comes from a very personal place, the poetry, yeah, completely. And that means, for example, that whenever it's rebuffed in any way or somebody doesn't like you, you're in danger of taking it very personally. But what I would say is, poetry is whatever you want it to be. There mustn't be any elites about it, you know. It's whatever you want it to be. If it's a nursery rhyme, if it's a limerick, if it's a ballad that you recite in the pub to people who enjoy listening to it, right the way through to somebody who wants to write the Iliad or the Odyssey, you know, a big long story in a poem. It's whatever you want it to be. And if it works for you and works for the people who are reading it and listening to it and get something from it, that's all to the good. I'm trying, I suppose, to, as I said, to give a voice to the voiceless, and I think that sounds patronizing, okay? And maybe that sounds patronizing, but I do think there is a kind of a lack. You've pointed to it a moment ago. There is a lack, with a few exceptions, of voices to speak out about the experiences that people had, for example, in security forces, you know, and just ordinary people who were living in communities like Shankill, like Sandy Row, like others around the countryside. There have been books written to speak, and there are more books going to be written to speak, and I think it's beginning to happen. I get a sense that there are novelists beginning to rise up, you know, with a voice to speak about what was experienced. My feeling is, you see, after a war comes to an end, very often it takes a while before the voices can really speak. I saw that with the First World War. It took a decade or two before people were really able to talk about having been through what they were through. It was the 30s, it was 20 years later, sometimes it was the 50s and 60s. And I think that will be the case in many ways for the unionist loyalist experience. I can't speak so much for the Republican experience, but I do know that there's a welling up eventually. There's a finding the words. There's a finding the vocabulary to say it, because to communicate what's happened to you is not always easy.
Yeah,
I mean, that's been my experience about working with trauma. You know, I've worked with a number of people in trauma groups, and I'm training at the moment in counselling because I'm really, really interested in that. That trauma very often can nestle inside you for decades, and then something triggers it and it's up. And it's important at that moment to be able to find some way to speak of what's happened to you, to kind of acknowledge what has happened to you, and to find others ready to listen to it. May not agree with what you say, but they're ready to listen in.
But it's for me, I mean, the point you make, for me, it is the voice rather than the agreement that we need to move from. We all need to have a voice. We all need to have. And I think, and I want to return briefly to the First World War, and then I want to move on again. And one of the things that struck me when we first began to do speaking tours together was that you never sought to glorify the First World War. You talked about it in all of its horrors and all of its idiosyncrasies. When you go into a community who holds the First World War so precious to their identity, and you begin to not be overly critical, but to kind of ask them to question, was it all glory, or was there an element of it that was less glorious? Do you meet resistance to people say, well, my uncle didn't say that, or my granddad didn't say that, or do you find people able to listen?
Let me take it back a bit. Way back in the short, a few years after the Somme book was published, I went to the Ulster Tower and I signed my name in the Ulster Tower visitors book on the side of the battlefield as Irish. Yeah. Which doesn't deny the British side of my identity at all. But I signed it that way because there were Irish regiments there. They were called the Royal Irish Rifles. But anyway, I entered into correspondence. Correspondence was foisted on me by a chap who was very, very aggressive about what I'd done and said I'd betrayed the name of the Ulster Division, etc. And for a while, I kept quiet a bit because I felt a degree of threat. And you know, a moment that changed all this was when Gusty Spence invited me to take part in an event in East Belfast, and all the guys like Hutchison and all had just come out of jail. And I felt he was offering a critique of what had happened in terms of the social structure of society that had left loyalist working class people, in a halfpenny place. And I felt able to sort of offer a more, I would call it balanced, but maybe a more critical analysis of what it's like for young men to be sent to the front or to feel drawn to the front to fight against young Germans in a war that benefited nobody, I would say. Mm-hmm. And I think from then on, I felt very able, as you know, when we're talking together in the Poppy and the Lily project, to say, look, I'm happy to wear the poppy. I'm happy to wear it for personal reasons. I have a great uncle who died in the First War. I have another ancestor who fought against Hitler and in the Second War. And for those reasons, I'm very proud to do it, but I recognize that I have to wear my symbols humbly, and recognition also that that may not be the perception at all of that flower to other people. And I would ask the same of people who wear other flowers for other political causes, whether it's the Easter lily or whatever else. So yeah, I think to do that alongside to speak with a sense of ownership and a sense of recognition of the pride, but at the same time to be able to sort of just unpack the story of how this event, the First World War, has evolved through the decades. How commemoration has happened. What are the stories we keep telling ourselves? Are there other stories that we should start to think about as well? We have a certain story about the trenches in the First World War, but does that prepare us for the future? What's going to prepare us for what can we find in our heritage that's going to enable us to live with our neighbour and to build a new society, build a fresher society? That's partly about courage, and it's partly about standing your ground for what you believe, but it's also about adaptability. It's about learning the craft of words and enjoying words and enjoying communication. I think that's my response to what you're saying, Joe.
And it strikes me that history as a tool is can be a great liberator. It doesn't necessarily have to be a restrainer. When we do our own talk, the Lily and the Poppy, and we've done it everywhere. We've done it in Orange Halls, we've done it in Republican gatherings and all of that, and non-political gatherings. That the questions that you ask tend to be from the people who come and think they know the most. They think that the lily is something other, or the poppy is something other than it is. And so you get that cross-fertilization. I want to move on from your writing skills, and because we talked when I introduced you, I talked about you being a playwright, and I want to just touch briefly. We're eating time, as they say, as we go along. The plays, and I know you've been involved in producing and writing a number of plays. You've also been involved in giving active assistance for communities to do it. Is it a whole new type of work?
Having had a background as an English and drama teacher, it's not an unfamiliar field to work with theatre. I suppose I should just best give a couple of examples of the kind of work I did. One was back in 2012. I worked with a couple of actors, both Falls Road men, by the way. Well, there were 3 actors, but 2 in particular who carried the load of much of it. Both Falls Road guys, familiar to Falls Road drama audiences, but we did a play about the Ulster Covenant. And some of the other stuff that happened that particular year. And we took it around venues galore, really, all kinds of venues. And we all always tried to have a discussion afterwards, a debate about it afterwards. And I think we could probably have done more of the discussion and debate. And sometimes the problem with that kind of drama is the people who would be best staying on to talk are the people who leave.
Yeah.
You follow the people who stay on
Yeah.
for the discussion already are familiar with talking with their neighbour or their opposite. So I would qualify that. But then the second one, more recently, 2016, I wrote a play about two women who happened to meet up on a snowy night in the Glenshane Pass in a pub and can't get out of the pub because of the snow. And over a glass of whiskey, they have to talk to each other and discover that each of them, it's 1966, by the way, okay?
Yeah.
The year of the play is 66. And each of them discovers they have a connection to 1916, the Battle of the Somme or Easter Rising. And over an hour, they have a conversation with each other and try to come to some kind of a argumentative conversation and a reconciliation. And so we showed that different places. We showed it in the Ardoyne, certainly in Old Park area. We showed it in Lurgan. We showed it in a variety of spots, again, with a discussion. I thought it was important to do 1966 because we were then talking about the centenary of all these events. That was the reason for doing these plays.
Yeah.
100 years later, how do you feel about all of that? And it was important to look at 1966 and recognize, what was about to unleash upon all of us in the late 1960s. And to recognize that, maybe if we'd had some of the discussions back then that we didn't have, some of the worst of what happened might have been averted.
Well, I think that's a fair assumption. I think if people have had the skills, the confidence to talk, I think a lot of stuff that went on may well have had a different complexion. I'm going to move you off all of that just again. You're in England at the moment, so I don't know England very well. What part of England are you in?
This morning I'm in St Albans. It's where I'm living at the moment. I have been training in counselling, therapist skills. Initially, I did this up in Norwich, which, as you heard earlier, was somewhere I first visited when I was a kid at university. And then I've been following that up with a diploma in what's called Gestalt counselling.
Yeah,
in here in St Albans. My partner is here. I live with my partner. And so by November of next year, I should be fully qualified. I'm starting on placements in the next few weeks and learning the craft of counselling. It's always been interesting to me, the counselling route. I benefited it from myself, as many people have, down through the years of having somebody to listen to you and gently maybe help direct you towards self-healing. And I would like to be able to use those skills in future. And I guess with COVID too, that has added a whole dimension to the need, because I think a lot of us got locked away in horrible ways. And, there's a lot of talking needs done and a lot of listening needs done,
Are you enjoying it? Or maybe is that the wrong question?
I'm really enjoying it very much. Yeah, it's a very interesting world to work in, and just to learn what it is to listen. I'm 60. What am I now? 66. And you kind of face the question to yourself, maybe by this stage in life, you should be putting on slippers. I don't believe that, and I don't think you do either, Joe.
I don't believe it.
I'm not suggesting you're as much as 66 now.
Oh, I'm far more than 66.
Are you indeed?
Yes, I'm 70.
Right.
So tell me, do you get away? You're there, you're enjoying all of that. Are you always chasing something new to do? Or yes?
I think so, yeah. Yes, definitely. I think you need to keep on being alive, you know, and keeping on seeking new stuff to do, but not in an aimless kind of way, you know. It's not like picking a hobby, though that's okay if you do pick one that you enjoy. It's more about following the same path, I think. You know, it's about communication again, you know, I think, and about people, about having people at the heart of what you're trying to do, I believe.
Is your, and I hope the answer to this is no, but is your studying interfering with your writing, or are you able to balance with both? And if you are, what is the writing project in hand?
Well, the book, The Illustrated History of Flight, came out in January or so, and I've still got a few copies left. If anybody's interested, they're very welcome to look at my website and pick one up and hopefully pay for it as well.
Yes, of course.
But I've been involved in another project, a group that I've been involved with on and off called Reclaim the Enlightenment in North Belfast. John Gray, and others involved in it. They just brought out a booklet that I have written called The Secret Chain. And it's about Francis Hutcheson, the 18th century philosopher. Now, most philosophy is a closed book to me when it gets too technical, but Hutcheson in the early 18th century, born in St. Fields, trained in Killalay, became a professor at Glasgow and taught all kinds of people. Huge influence in the American Revolution. His philosophy is a really interesting story. And I called it, I referred to it as a book about the Enlightenment and what is the relevance for Ireland today, North and South, of his writings. And you know what Hutcheson has to say is, look, basically, we are fundamentally capable of good and community and care for one another. And I was arguing that perhaps some of the economics that has gone on in Ireland in recent years has not taken account of that. I see James Connolly sitting behind you here, by the way. So what James Connolly has to say about economics is also interesting indeed. Although I wouldn't describe myself as a Connollyite, but that there's interesting analysis that he offers, you know. And so the book is really trying to put Ireland under the microscope a little bit through the writings of Francis Hutcheson. So thankfully that little booklet's on the go now as well. And the poetry, hope to keep it going. And certainly, you know, I would like to be able to bring my counselling skills to home, you know. I'm conscious of personal reasons to be here as well as professional reasons in my training, but you know, home is still home, and you know, that's vital. Yeah.
We that rapping sound that you heard is the engineer telling me to tell you your time is up. But I just want to make one point or one observation, if I don't mind. That period, those years of enlightenment that centered around the Presbyterian community, but not totally, in the city of Belfast, that period that was around in the aftermath of the 1798 rebellion and all of that period that was driven in Belfast, you know, that liberalization of a town, and then, you know, it was squashed through economic repression and all of that stuff. It's fascinating. I think it's a sign of how good, or it's a lesson of how good we can all be. You know, that sharing, caring, distribution of wealth, caring for each other. I think it's something, it's a little known period of history, but it's something that we all should be familiar with. So, having said that, can I thank you for the journey you brought me on? I thank you for the journey you brought our listeners on. As always, you're fascinating, and I look forward to myself and you to our next road show. So my guest, Philip Orr, thank you.
Thank you, Joe. It's been a pleasure, as always.